Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today on the podcast, I talk with Patrick Steele, the author of the new book, Home of the Braves, The Battle for Baseball in Milwaukee. When the Boston Braves came to Milwaukee in 1953, the city overwhelmingly embraced Major League Baseball. Within 5 years, the team won a World Series and 2 pennants. I talked to Steele about why the team left, some of the interesting stories from the time of the Milwaukee Braves, and what he thinks of public financing of stadiums.
People lament, we're, using, taxpayer dollars to build multi-billion-dollar arenas for billionaire owners and millionaire players. And it's true. But if you don't, somebody else will. And you have to make that determination. Are you as a community better with professional sport or without?
Steele is an associate professor of history at Concordia University, Wisconsin. He is also a member of the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association. Here's our chat. Why did this subject interest you? I'm sure it took a lot of research. So why did you want to dedicate so much time to writing this book?
Well, I think because the story's never been told about why they left. My interest in the project started back in 1988, and I reference this in the book when Bob Bege's book, The Milwaukee Braves, A Baseball Eulogy, came out. And that's one of my go-to books. I mean, I've probably read that thing 4 or 5 times in my life, cover to cover. And it's just, I love it. And, the only thing is it never really fully explained why the team left. I mean, I don't know how you go from being that successful to all of a sudden fans aren't coming out and, some of the other dynamics that were in place. And so the first time I got to meet Bob, I kind of asked him those questions and I said, that's what I want to know. So when I started doing the research project, my goal was in essence to be part 2 of what Bob Bege's book was, to answer the questions why the team then ultimately left. So I don't talk about the players on the field. I don't talk about, managerial decisions. I talk about why the team came, why it was successful on the front end, why it failed ultimately and moved to Atlanta. And I asked Bob to write the foreword for that particular reason because I wanted that symmetry between his book and mine.
I think it's also interesting you write about how the team got here in the first place too. So maybe that's a good place to start as well. And do you think some of the seeds for them leaving were sowed in the first year and how they got to the city?
Oh, absolutely. The Milwaukee plan of building a municipal stadium with a large amount of parking, comparative to other baseball stadiums at the time, really set the model for other teams. And with the Boston franchise, like other teams that had other cities rather had 2 teams, the team that always moved was the one that was second in everybody's hearts. They were second in attendance. They were second in performance, whatever it would be. And when the Braves came to Milwaukee, other cities saw what the response was. You went from about 280,000 their last year in Boston to, 1.5 million in Milwaukee the first year. And the dollar signs, are in every owner's eyes that, hey, all we got to do is go somewhere and we will go from being a second-tier team in a crappy old stadium to being the only game in town in a brand new stadium with all this new revenue. So yeah, it did change the dynamics of baseball, and it did sow the seeds ultimately for their move to Atlanta because Atlanta mirrored in many ways what Milwaukee had done.
Talk to me a little bit about the Boston Braves when they were in Boston and their owner, Lou Perini. Talk about him and why he made the decision ultimately to move to Milwaukee.
His decision to move the team was obviously based on what they were doing in Boston. The attendance had dropped off, fairly precipitously. They went to the World Series in 1948. They drew again, I think it was about 1.2, 1.5 million, somewhere in that ballpark. And he agreed to start televising games. And when you think of how few televisions there actually were between 1948 and 52, you're not talking every house has 2 television sets. Most of them were in bars, places like that. But he saw attendance plummet by 90%. Now, his goal was, because he owned his own stadium in Boston, was to do improvements. And so he had appealed to the National League to do some improvements, change the lines a little bit, make the depth a little bit different down the center field, left field kind of corner. There were some general improvements he wanted to do to Braves Field. and he got voted down. What he wanted to do was, knowing there was some talent coming up through the system. He had a rookie Eddie Matthews had a decent year in 1952, but certainly looked like he had the makings of an all-star. You had Warren Spahn at the peak of his career, and you're thinking, boy, with the talent coming through, if you can just make it through 1953, you're probably going to be okay. What happened was Bill Vack. Bill Vack owned the St. Louis Browns. Again, a second team status. Ironically, the Cardinals rented the stadium, Sportsman's Park, from the Browns, but they had far more attendance, so the Browns are the ones kind of getting pushed out of their own ballpark. So Vack wants to do something he thinks is a great idea. Back in the 40s, he had been the owner of the minor league Milwaukee Brewers. He knew Milwaukee was a great baseball town, knew they were building this new municipal stadium. So he made overtures to bring his team here. And as soon as you go public that you're looking to move your team, what happens to attendance if you're a second-tier team, right? It plummets. You become a pariah. You become toxic. So by him going vocal about it, pretty much sealed the fate that either the Browns would come or somebody else had to. Now, the Braves owned the Milwaukee territorial rights because they bought the minor league Brewers back in 1946. And Lou Perini's goal was, and he had other territories. He had Toronto. I mean, there was rumors that he wanted to maybe take the team to Toronto. But Milwaukee had this brand new municipal stadium. Fred Miller, the president of Miller Brewing Company, had gone out, met with him a couple times. Really, I don't want to say strong arm, but it was pretty close to it. Perini and I saying, look, you got to come. The stadium's here, and if you deprive us of baseball, everybody will remember that. They got permission from the Cubs because the Cubs technically had the territory because we're within 90 miles of Chicago. Phil Wrigley agreed to waive it, allowing the Braves to come in. Perini made the decision, pending some approval by Milwaukee County to put some additional enhancements to Milwaukee County Stadium, even though it was a brand new ballpark, new lighting, new office space, some of those things, which the county would agree to. And with that, Perini will make the decision to bring his team here. But I think in his heart, he honestly wished he could have kept him in Boston. He was a Boston guy. Kept his home out there. And that would be also one of the problems the Braves had, was that out-of-town ownership.
Set the stage of Milwaukee at this time, in the time that they were trying to lure the Braves to the city. Where was the city economically, and why did the county really want to bring a Major League Baseball team to the city? Was there something just they wanted to be that major league level? They wanted to be a major league city? Is that kind of the aspect that they were going for?
Well, absolutely. I mean, without Major League Baseball, you're Wichita, right? You're Des Moines. And so there was that aspect. But, Milwaukee had come through World War II fairly economically prosperous. And it's not just Milwaukee or Milwaukee County. It's all of southeastern Wisconsin. You have industry all over the place. The economy still in Wisconsin at that point is manufacturing, very, very blue collar. And, the idea of a municipal stadium really seemed to make a lot of sense. And baseball was king. In America, it was America's pastime, and if you had one of the few major league franchises, you were a city that was above everybody else. And Fred Miller, I think, understood this, and he had been instrumental in not only County Stadium, but he was also instrumental in building the arena downtown where the NBA's, the Milwaukee Hawks played for a while, and eventually, obviously, the Bucks will come there and play. But he was instrumental in getting that done. And I think he simply believed that if you have the stadium, if you have the asset in place and a team can come in, you have already elevated your status. And Wisconsin already had the National Football League, which, again, in comparison in popularity, was way below where Major League Baseball was. But you had that opportunity to be something more than Indianapolis. And Milwaukee got it. And that was an amazing thing. And I think the most amazing telling element about it was when you talk about the economy, you talk about southeastern Wisconsin. If you look at the numbers of the people that came to games, now again, this doesn't include people who went to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games, but if you just average out the number of people that came through the gates at County Stadium versus the population around it, most years it was like 90 to 92% of the population came to at least one game. That's staggering when you consider how small of an area that actually, is in comparison to the entire state of Wisconsin. But they drew well, and they drew much better from the area than other teams had done.
Most people don't know life before the Brewers even, but some people might vaguely know the Braves were here at some point. But Talk about a little bit about the city's experience with baseball. Before that, there were teams here. There were minor league teams. What was kind of the city's relationship with baseball prior to the 1950s?
Milwaukee was always a great baseball town. They had several ballparks where minor league baseball was played, but most of it centered around Old Borchard Field. And again, Bob Beege wrote a book on Borchard Field, so if you're interested in that, take a look at it. Bob, I hope you're listening because I'm always promoting your books. But we had several minor league teams. The one that ultimately, made it was the American Association Milwaukee Brewers. We have the legacy of that name here much longer than the Braves. The colors of the old Brewers were navy blue and red, so there's some symmetry there. What people remember is that the famous Milwaukee Braves baseball cap was actually the minor league Brewers cap before that. So there's that legacy. But we also had an All-American girls professional baseball team, the Milwaukee Chicks. There was a Negro League team here, the Milwaukee Bears, that played for, I believe it was one season. So we always had a great connection with baseball. And Milwaukee, with its connections with Bill Veeck, it was a great town to have people come through, catch a game. We had some great players filter through, not only through the Brewers organization, but coming into play. For example, Mickey Mantle's rookie year, when he got sent down to the minor league, the first place he ended up playing was at Borchard Field against the Brewers. So, it was a great connection. And Milwaukee, I think, was always described, and I still believe, is a great baseball town.
Were there champions that enabled the stadium to be made at the local level? Were there civic leaders that were really instrumental in building it? And what's kind of the backstory of like how that stadium, Milwaukee County Stadium, got built?
There was a lot of civic leaders, and it goes back almost to the first part of the 20th century, the idea of building a new stadium, because Borchard Field was antiquated. It was made of wood. You had problems with fires, that type of thing. And so the idea of building a stadium had always been there. But it really was Fred Miller. And I'm going to give him a lot of the credit because he really got civic leaders on board throughout the county. And they found a plot of land that made sense. It was kind of centrally located. It was out in the open. You could put these big parking lots up because, Wisconsin was becoming a little bit more mobile. You had roads across most of the state. So if you're going to come to a game, it made sense to have it somewhere outside of the city. So they built the ballpark on land that had been federal land, where right now the Clement Zablocki Veterans Hospital used to be called the Old Soldiers Home. And it actually took an act of Congress to get the land passed, and Harry Truman had to sign off on it to get the land turned over to Milwaukee County. And that happened. Unfortunately, they tried building the stadium in the middle of the Korean War, and there was a steel shortage, so it took a little bit longer to build than what they had anticipated. But honestly, I think it would turn out to be in the best interest of the future of baseball in Milwaukee because the stadium was ready to open when the Braves showed up. It was a brand new ballpark. Nobody else had played in it.
After studying what Milwaukee County did to build Milwaukee County Stadium and kind of carrying that forward over time, that's been a model that's been replicated throughout history, throughout the next 50, 60 years, including maybe recently with the Milwaukee Bucks new arena. I'm just kind of curious what you think of it, taking the historical perspective of what Milwaukee County did and kind of what is happening today. What's kind of the historical perspective from your opinion on that?
Well, it was funny because I was working on this book when the whole debate over the Bucks arena came up, and it's been said in movies, if you build it, they will come, or if you build it, he will come, I think is the actual quote. But, I've come to look at it this way. If you don't build it, they will leave. And communities have to make that decision, what makes them a better community. There are a lot of people that I know that are not basketball fans that don't really care about the NBA, but are glad that the new arena is there because we are a better community with the Bucks than without the Bucks. I think the same thing went with Miller Park. County Stadium was a serviceable stadium. It was not a Taj Mahal. It was an old ballpark with no old ballpark charm. The idea of renovating it or put a roof over that really did not solve the problems that some people thought it could. And that's where the idea of, Miller Park being kind of a destination place to some degree, you're always going to catch a game there. There's always something new. It creates a different dynamic. But the bigger story is we still have baseball. And the communities that have opted not to do those things have lost professional sports. Seattle did not want to build a new basketball arena. Their team left. The St. Louis City Council did not want to put improvements into the football stadium down in St. Louis. The Rams left. that's the story. So are you better off being economically frugal with taxpayer dollars, which every politician says they want to do, and taxpayers certainly don't want to pay more in tax money. People lament, we're, using, taxpayer dollars to build multi-billion-dollar arenas for billionaire owners and millionaire players. And it's true. But if you don't, somebody else will. And you have to make that determination. Are you as a community better with professional sport or without?
Now, we've talked a little bit about what it meant for Milwaukee to get a major league team at that point. What did it mean for Major League Baseball for a team to relocate, relocate at all, but also to relocate to the West?
Well, Milwaukee was the Braves were the first team to move in 50 years. Obviously there was transportation. There were some of those elements that were involved with it. But it showed that a new city could be excited for baseball. That if you went from a stadium where, like at Braves Field, for example, if you were a visiting team and they were averaging 3,000 fans at a game, and you go to Milwaukee County Stadium and you're getting a cut of the visitors pay, and they got 40,000 in the stadium, well, where would you rather be? Right? Your revenue check is going to be bigger playing in Milwaukee County than it would be at Braves Field. And so that becomes the economic model. Hey, look, we as owners, even though we're not the group that owns that particular franchise, we will benefit by them moving to somewhere where there's going to be new fans. And the owners always believe we can make new fans. So I think that's part of the story as well. The economic viability of baseball became dependent on teams moving. They got rid of the dead weight in Philadelphia when the Athletics moved. They got rid of the dead weight in Washington when the original Senators moved. They got rid of the dead weight, in Boston, frankly, when the Braves moved. And for many of those cities, the teams that remained became much better financially in the long term than they would have been if fighting for the hearts and minds of two different teams.
Talk to me a little bit about the fan reaction when the team showed up, the Braves show up in town. What is the reaction of Milwaukee baseball fans?
Oh, it was electric. And again, I didn't live through it. And so when you talk to the people that have, that's one of the words I'll use, it's electric. The entire community jumped in with both feet. The local newspapers assigned reporters right away to the Major League Baseball beat. And, there was a parade that, welcomed the team to town and took them all the way out to County Stadium. And they would show up early for batting practice, and players were given gifts. And, the fabled stories, Wally Rank of Rank & Son, Buick is giving away cars, giving them a year lease on a car, whatever it was that, the players could drive. It was great advertising for them. Free milk, free bread. Eddie Matthews talked about years later, he couldn't even mow his own lawn. Somebody was there cutting it. But there was a connection to the players to the town because the town really took them in, and they knew what it was like in Boston, where they really were second-rate citizens compared to the Red Sox in many ways. And they come to Milwaukee, and they were bigger than the Packers. They were bigger than the Green Bay Packers. And they were beloved on the front end. And, Milwaukee kind of had a reputation at the national level. They said, they're cheering for foul balls and they're doing this. And you see this reflected in some of the stories. But Milwaukee actually was a fairly good baseball town. They kind of knew that, but they were just excited to have baseball. And, the fan numbers went up. When you consider they moved, they had barely 2 weeks to get season tickets sold. And they still put about 1.5 million in the stadium that year without a season tickets, advanced sales, nothing like that. Just dropping it in cold. They had to go take all the tickets they'd printed out for the Brewers, because the Brewers were supposed to play in there. They basically had to cut the lease with the Brewers, let them go. They moved to Toledo, take all the tickets, burn them, reprint all new tickets, and then tell all the people, look, if you bought tickets to see the Brewers and you were behind the dugout, well, now that the Braves are here, because it's Major League Baseball, it's going to cost you a lot more for those seats. So if you don't want to pay more, you're now going to be moved, down to the right field side or somewhere else. And the fans opened up their wallets and bought season tickets, and they bought tickets like you wouldn't believe. And concessions, just anything would sell. Anything with a Braves logo on it sold. It was amazing the amount of stuff that was being sold.
And on the field, the team was pretty successful almost right away, eventually winning a world championship. Do you think that fan excitement kind of fed into the team's success?
Well, I think that obviously there was a little bit of that as well. Because the Milwaukee fans, again, really were very supportive. The team comes in 1953. They get the All-Star game already, in 1955. They go to the World Series in 57. I think the team fed off the fans' enthusiasm, and the fans fed off not just the fact that the baseball team was here, but it was successful. And that is the story about the Braves, because every other team that moved had a settling effect. When the Browns moved to Baltimore and became the Orioles, they drew, more than 1 million fans their first year, and then it kind of settled down, a little bit below that. When the Athletics moved to Kansas City, you saw the same thing. You see this huge spike that first year, and then you get the settling effect. You never had the settling effect in Milwaukee until after 1959. And, the attendance dropped a little bit in 58. It went down a little bit more in 59, but that wasn't the settling effect. The settling effect was after, when it dropped down to just over 1 million, then below 1 million. And somewhere in there, it would have probably risen back up again and been somewhere in that 900 to 1.5 million on a regular basis, at least through the 1960s. So I think there's a connection between both, fan excitement over the team responding to the fan excitement, and great players bringing championships. I mean, you were in 2 World Series. How cool is that?
You write about the Milwaukee Miracle, the idea of the Milwaukee Miracle. Who coined that phrase, and what did it mean?
Well, I'm not really sure who coined it. Just it was in the media a lot. It's certainly talked about in other books. Baseball owners talked about it as well. But it was the idea that you could take a second-tier team, put them in a brand new ballpark in a brand new city, and attendance skyrockets, and the entire community economically benefits from it. You have people coming in from out of town, staying at hotels, buying gasoline, buying groceries, patronizing restaurants, buying beer, whatever it is, and enjoying baseball in ways that they never had before. People weren't doing that to catch a game at Borchard Field. They were doing that to catch a game at County Stadium. That's the miracle, that you had this high attendance, high fan interest, and economic development as a result.
Do you have a favorite story that you uncovered in your research about when times were good in Milwaukee, when times were good with the Braves, of just how excited the fans were? Is there a particular story that stands out in your mind that's emblematic of the whole thing?
Well, I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but it's one of my favorite stories that came out of it. And it was actually the story of the bratwurst. And, it's something you think of as a staple, in Milwaukee. If you go to a game anywhere right now in Wisconsin, right, you get brats. And that wasn't always the case. When the team came in 53, they didn't sell bratwurst at the stadium. It was either 54 or 55 when the team was on the road. An elderly gentleman showed up at the ballpark and talked to the assistant concessions manager and says, "Hey, I think we could sell these at the ballpark." And the manager, "Well, we've already got enough stuff. We sell ham and cheese sandwiches. We got hot dogs. We got all that stuff." And he's like, "Well, let's just try these." So they fired up one of the grills and they threw a couple of the brats on to cook them up. And they're like, not a lot of grease. They were good. They just put them on a hot dog bun. They're like, "Hey, these are pretty good." So they cooked them up and tried to sell them at the games, but nobody knew what they were. So nobody bought them. So then they tried to get a couple of the players to eat them walking into the ballpark. So when you're walking in from your car, you're eating a bratwurst, people asking you what it is. Within 2 years, Sports Illustrated says if you go to County Stadium, you got to have a bratwurst. So that became the story of baseball in Milwaukee, is if you come here, you got to have a beer and you got to have a brat.
Another interesting tidbit in your book that I found interesting was how tailgating kind of came to be because of just the unique aspect of where County Stadium was built and all the ample parking lot around it.
Well, tailgating was big in the South. I mean, Southern football, had a lot of tailgating. That's fairly, popular down there. But tailgating for baseball was unheard of because none of the stadiums that existed at the time really had sufficient parking. When you think of the classic ballparks of the day, Fenway Park, there's no parking. Wrigley Field, there's no parking. Ebbets Field, there's no parking. The Polo Grounds, there's no place that you could do that. And you get to Milwaukee and you've got these expansive lots that funnel cars in eventually once the interstate system goes in from all over the place. It made logical sense that that's what you could do because that's what people did up at City Stadium up in Green Bay, for Packer games. And so the idea of tailgating for baseball really, I believe, does kind of come out of Milwaukee. Other minor league teams say, well, we had tailgating for, it's like, arguing who had the first hamburger. In the end, it doesn't really matter. We know people point to County Stadium and say that's really where it became an art.
What was the attendance of the Milwaukee Braves compared to the rest of the league?
Well, if you look at all of Major League Baseball, in the 13 seasons the Braves played in Milwaukee, only one team outdrew them in total attendance, and that was the Dodgers. And the Dodgers played in Brooklyn at storied old Ebbets Field, and eventually they played in Los Angeles at the Coliseum, and then eventually Dodger Stadium. So the Dodgers were the only ones that actually outdrew them The Braves, they were pacing the league, and they drew over 2 million fans a couple of those years. I mean, that was astonishing. I don't know if people are aware, but for the Braves organization, the attendance they had in 1957 was still their record going into the 90s during their World Series run that the Atlanta Braves had. The 1957 attendance was still higher before it was finally broken in the 90s. So that shows you where they were with attendance. The problem is it created a false idea of what attendance would always be.
2 million fans that's a pretty big number.
Oh, it was spectacular, and it was the record even in Milwaukee until 1983. You know, it was an astonishing record for the longest time, and they really were the benchmark for what could happen if you moved a team. Unfortunately for the fans of Milwaukee, like I said, you know, that the ownership expected that because there wasn't a settling effect, that it would never happen. And the problem with baseball is it's harder to sustain those big numbers in baseball as opposed to football. You know, you look, for example, at Lambeau Field, they get 8 games a year plus a couple preseason games. Those tickets are always in high demand simply for that reason. That's why they're always sold out. If the Packers played 40 games a year up at Lambeau, I don't think the sellout streak would still be in place. Now, people can say, oh, you're not. Well, no, I just think if something is not as in demand, you're not going to have a sellout. We saw that happen at Fenway Park. You know, Fenway ran through a process where 2003, 4, 5, a couple years after that too, they were sold out every game. And what happened? The team settled a little bit, and then all of a sudden tickets became available again. So there's always going to be that settling effect when a team's not as good. But attendance really was just spectacular when you consider where the team had been before they came, and all the other owners looking at that and just thinking, boy, that could be us.
So what happened? I mean, why did the team eventually leave? What was kind of the process? Obviously, the settling of the numbers and of attendance, but were there other things that led to the Milwaukee Braves leaving for Atlanta?
Yes, there are quite a lot of factors. They went to the World Series in 1957. They won. It's a great story. Well, immediately afterwards, the county and the Braves had to renegotiate their stadium lease. And it was very contentious. Milwaukee County had an attitude of, well, now we're going to make our money on the stadium, because they gave them, you know, kind of a sweetheart deal on the front end. The Braves volunteered to pay more, but, you know, you had a process where, you know, the county built the stadium. The Braves were in there relatively cheap. The county felt that we owe it to our taxpayers, the people that built the stadium, to get the revenue out of it that we can. So they structured the lease in such a way that it turned out to be a short-term lease. What the Braves wanted was a 3-year lease where they could up it, you know, club option to do, you know, every couple of years they could renew it themselves. The county didn't want to do that. Nobody thought of locking them into a 25-year deal. And the county didn't want to do that, frankly, because they were afraid they were going to lose out on revenue. So if we lock them in at this low rate and all of a sudden they're doing really well, we're going to lose money. So they went for the shorter route as opposed to the longer route. But it was very heated. It was very contentious. When you think, you know, here you just won the World Series. You think everybody would be going, all right, what can we do to keep you here? And they were probably the worst series of negotiations the Braves had trying to stay in Milwaukee. But eventually they got a deal cut, kept them in County Stadium until 62. So that opens up the can of worms again in 62 when they've got to go through the process again. They agree to stay 62, 63, 64, 65, and then the lease is up. And of course, at the end of that, the Braves had left. So that's part of the problem. Another problem was the cost of keeping the team in Milwaukee became astronomical compared to other teams. Most people are not aware, and I was actually shocked when I read this, that the Braves paid more to use County Stadium than any other team paid to use their facilities, which meant that the Braves were already economically disadvantaged compared to other teams. We talked about the expansive parking lots before. The Braves were obligated to maintain the parking lots, provide lighting, do all that stuff, and did not make a dime of revenue off the parking. The county got it all. So there were things that the Braves were required to do that other teams, frankly, did not have to do. And that comes out of your bottom line. There was one county supervisor, as I'm going through and doing the research, who said basically, well, you know, if you're playing in a municipal stadium and we're cutting you this deal, you should almost operate like a nonprofit. You know, how you can't do that. You can't do that and succeed as a baseball team. So I think you had, two things in play. You had a county that didn't really understand what the dynamics of baseball were. You had out-of-town ownership. And then you take those two factors, and now you add on the rise of football at the expense of baseball going into the 1960s, which cost the Braves, frankly, coverage in the newspapers, and it does cost them attendance at the game. There's no doubt about it. Football really became king in America. Most people said by 1964, especially young people, that football was their favorite sport more than baseball. And you think in Milwaukee or think in Wisconsin, what's the dynamic of football in the 1960s? You got Lombardi's Packers.
Is it partly because of television?
Television's part of it. The Braves never televised any games in Milwaukee until 64 for two reasons. Perini was afraid of it. He thought it was going to kill off baseball like it did in Boston. But the county was afraid of it too because they thought they're going to lose revenue by people staying home and watching it on TV. You're not going to come out to the stadium and buy a hot dog, and you're not going to buy a bratwurst eventually or a ham and cheese or whatever it was going to be. So the county really was reluctant to do it too. And so they had some very draconian language written into the leases that if the Braves decided to telecast games, particularly home games, that the cost of the stadium lease went up dramatically. So there was a little bit of fighting on both sides of that. So, and I don't think that Major League Baseball understood the advantage of televising games. I certainly think baseball understands it now. I mean, what was the weird dynamic yesterday? You could watch the Brewers game only on Facebook, right. But they're trying to find all these other platforms to broadcast the games, to make it available. And so you don't have to be locked into a television. We could be sitting in an office here and we could be watching the game on our phones. It's much different way they market it now versus the 1950s. They thought the only way they make money, the only way people are getting excited is to walk out and see the game live on the field. They didn't understand how television can create the excitement at home to make people want to go out to the ballpark as well. And you end up with a more knowledgeable fan base, whatever. But so I think that, that becomes part of the long-term problem as well.
Are there villains in the book?
Oh, there's a lot of villains in the book.
Who are some of the villains?
Well, I say this with all due respect because you would not have baseball in Milwaukee without Lou Perini. But he's kind of villain number one because I think he was a little bit duplicitous in dealing with the county, particularly towards the end. When the Dodgers and the Giants left to go to New York at the end of the 57 season, Perini went out to New York in 58. Some people speculate he went out there shopping the Braves around. Others think, and I kind of fall into this, that maybe he was looking to see if he could get the expansion team if there was one that would come. So he'd sell the Braves to local ownership and pick up the expansion team, whatever. Again, I don't know. I have no evidence one way or another. It's just, it happened. He acknowledged he was out there talking. So, he's part of it, the absentee ownership. People question whether or not he was going to sell the team to Fred Miller. When Fred Miller was killed in a plane crash in December of 1954, Lou Perini had said, well, I was talking with Fred about selling the team to him, that would have given local ownership, that type of thing. It looked well in the newspaper, it looked well in Sports Illustrated when they interviewed him. In 1966 in the court case, Perini denied that he'd ever done that he'd never negotiated with Fred Miller to sell the team. So, there's a little bit of that. He played his cards. But again, we wouldn't have had baseball without him. So, he's not a total villain, but he's obviously watching out for his own best interests. The next group that people point to is the group that bought the team, the young investors out of Chicago. Bill Bartholomew was the face of the organization. John McHale, the club president, people point to them, all greedy owners. Coca-Cola comes in, offers them a ton of money. They just simply wanted to go, which I don't think is true on the front end. I don't think they bought the team to move it. And I don't think they really wanted to until it became apparent that they overpaid for the team and it was not going to financially, make it in Milwaukee. So obviously they're an easy villain because they were the ones that owned the team when it left.
So they bought the team in what year?
The end of 62.
And they were kind of a Chicago-based group.
Yeah, but there was a lot of people that had Wisconsin connection. I mean, Fred Miller's nephew was part of it. There was from the Johnson Wax Company. There was a couple of their heirs. I mean, there were a lot of people that had money, and they wanted to be baseball owners. And it was harder to be a baseball owner that was a U.S. senator at the time. So you're talking about a very, very restricted club of people. And so they bought the team. They wanted to be owners, so they weren't looking to buy it and turn around and sell it to somebody else. They're part of the problem. But I think, my book exposes, a group of villains that have not been really identified before, and that was Milwaukee County. I think that in many ways, the county treated the team much worse than people know. And by the time the county realized the situation the Braves were in, it was too late to fix the problem. And what they tried to do, very late in the deal is give them a bit more of a sweetheart deal. We'll let you, control your own concession prices and do some of those. it was too late. The Braves were already negotiating with Atlanta. And at that point, it was just a matter of time. What would have been nice is if in 57, they could have cut a 10-year lease. That would have kept the team in Milwaukee at least through 67. I believe had that happened, the team would still be here because Atlanta wanted an existing team as soon as their stadium opened. Their stadium opened in 64. The Atlanta Crackers, a AAA team, played there for the 1964 season. Or excuse me, it opened at the end of 64. The Crackers played there in 65. They were hoping the Braves were going to be there in 65. That didn't happen. And the Braves don't show up until 66. Had they had to wait 2 years from the time that stadium opened until the team came, so it actually would have been 3. 68 would have been the first year they would have been able to play there. I think somebody else would have been there, most likely the Cleveland Indians. But, the Milwaukee County was certainly part of the villains, in all of this. Had they gone for the 10-year lease, have they given them a sweetheart deal for 20 years? Absolutely, the Braves are still here. But it didn't happen that way.
I think another scenario that you allude to in the book of how they could have possibly stayed in Milwaukee was if Fred Miller had, and in fact, been able to buy the team as he might have been interested in, theoretically. If he had, do you feel like they would still be here?
Oh, yeah. I would have brought the economic weight of Miller Brewing behind him, much like Augie Busch when he bought the Cardinals. Brought the whole weight of the Anheuser-Busch Corporation behind the St. Louis Cardinals, and certainly there's that connection between the two of them now. I mean, it's fascinating to think of the Brewers or the Braves today rather playing in a place named Miller Park. I think Fred Miller, had he lived, had he been able to buy the team, certainly I think the idea of local ownership would have been much, much more entrenched in them. And that certainly was one of the failures. Even Perini said later on, he was interviewed after the Brewers came and he was out at Fenway Park and he's watching a game between the Red Sox and the Brewers. And, reporters kind of asked him, that was one of the things he alluded to. He's like, they always needed local ownership and he was never going to be it. He was never going to move to Milwaukee. His businesses were all out in Massachusetts and that's who he was. That's where he was from. Had Miller been able to buy it, even had he owned it and not wanted to own it for the long term, he would have found other local investors to buy the team out. I think there was a lot of reluctance for people to really embrace the team after Perini sold it because, again, he being a Boston guy, turning around selling it to a group of Chicago owners, there was always this fear the team was going to go. And it turned out the rumors were true.
Talk about the divorce a little bit. There's some legal battles that happened. And what was the kind of the fan reaction, the kind of the kids in the divorce, basically? What was the kind of the process of separating?
Well, in order to understand that, you actually have to go back earlier into the 1950s, back into the early era of the Milwaukee Miracle. The Braves, like every other team in Major League Baseball, was rumored to be going. So I think the earliest I saw a rumor the Braves were going to leave was some, a baseball official and offhanded, he was listing teams that might move, and one of the teams was the Braves. Well, it's 1955. They're doing well at County Stadium. Why would you even think the Braves would ever leave? But every team was rumored to be leaving. There was rumors the Yankees were going to move out to California. There was rumors that, the Red Sox were heading maybe to Florida, maybe, just a level of ridiculousness to the idea. But again, it seemed plausible because you saw what the Boston Braves did when they came to Milwaukee. If they could do it, imagine what the Red Sox could do if they went somewhere, or the Cubs went somewhere, right? So the idea that there was rumors to go really wasn't substantiated until the ownership group bought him at the end of 62, and the first rumor surfaced at the All-Star break in 1963. It was reported in the Sporting News that a deal had been cut for a long-term stadium lease to take the Braves to Atlanta, and it had been agreed upon. The Braves ownership at the point denied it, but it scared the Braves faithful back at home. Now, they only drew, it was about 770,000, I believe, in 1963, which was atrocious. It was a third of what they had done just in 1958. So clearly there was an attendance issue because the fans weren't coming out to the stadium like they had in the past. And it really lit a fire under Milwaukee County to get fans out to the stadium. The local media started pushing a lot of stories, saying, we got to back the Braves, we got to back the Braves. And all kinds of organizations, civic groups got together to figure out a way to make sure baseball could stay in Milwaukee and showcase that we could do it. So the rumor had been there, had been denied adamantly by the Braves ownership. Oh, this is never going to happen. We'll be in Milwaukee, today, tomorrow, and as long as we're wanted, which turned out to be a lie. But what else are you going to say? So when 1964 came, the goal was for a lot of the Milwaukee faithful to get the attendance between 1 million to 1.5 million. Because if you could do that, that was the number that the new ownership group said, if we draw between 1 million to 1.5 million, we're economically viable. So that was the goal. Milwaukee County city civic leadership, both political and business community, felt that they could do that. And they were not able to sell the number of season tickets they had promised. And they were not able to get as many fans through the gate. And they only drew, they drew under 1 million. It was over 900,000. But certainly they fell far short of the goal that they had wanted. And that really ultimately cemented the decision for the team to go to Atlanta. Now, part of this is also you have the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company in Milwaukee offering you about $500,000 a year for radio broadcasts. Coca-Cola is offering you $5 million a year. What would you do? Right? You get a 7-state radio network in the South. You get Wisconsin in the North. You start looking at the numbers. It made a lot of financial sense. But kids and fans don't understand it that way. Owners viewed owning a club like somebody would, view owning a bookstore or owning a plumbing business. If they decide they want to move from Madison to Greenbow, Alabama, to be down by, Forrest Gump, nobody's going to complain, except a few patrons that went to that bookstore, that plumbing shop. If you own a sports team, you are vested in the hearts and minds of the local population. There's a different dynamic at play. And so the fans did not understand how you could look at the string of success the team had at the gate and say, we can't make it here in Milwaukee. And they took it hard. And the hardest part was, what do you do? The Braves asked to leave at the end of the 64 season. They made it very clear. They thought it was like a player contract. You can have a player under contract, you can cut him. You still have to pay him, but you can cut him. So they simply presumed that a lease would work the same way, that they could just simply terminate their lease when they chose to, and they're on their way. Well, it didn't turn out to be that way. So now Milwaukee County has a tough decision to make. What do you do? There are a lot of kids, a lot of families out there who like the idea of baseball. This might be your only chance to enjoy it for a long time. Do you go out there and catch a game knowing you're putting money in the pockets of the team that's going to leave? Or do you boycott them and really stick it to the owners? Hopefully they incur this huge financial loss, and that's the kind of, screw you on the way out the door. And certainly there was an element to that. But the county itself is, they're also undetermined as to what they should do. Is the best policy simply to let them go? If you simply let them go so they can be in Atlanta in 65, does that put you in the good graces of baseball when baseball expands? Because clearly baseball was looking to expand. You can look at your track record and say, hey, look, we cooperated with you. We had this great level of attendance in the past. Should, in theory, put you to the front of the line for expansion. Many in the business community encourage Milwaukee to do that. Just let them go. Let them go. Let's look at getting an expansion team or another team to come here. One of the teams that was rumored to come was the Athletics. And well, okay, we'll be an American League team from this point forward, but we can get a team. There's another one that's out there. Milwaukee County decided to go the lawsuit route. Well, we'll sue them for depriving us of Major League Baseball. Now, we had no leverage to keep them here after our lease. Major League Baseball was under no obligation to keep Major League Baseball in Wisconsin. Where Milwaukee County and the state of Wisconsin thought they had leverage was because in every other team that moved, they were a second or a third team in a city. So when they left, for example, when the Dodgers and the Giants left New York, the Yankees were still there. So the New York metropolitan area was not denied Major League Baseball. When the Athletics left Philadelphia, the Phillies were still there. So no team was deprived of it. The closest you came was when the first incarnation of the Senators left to go to Minnesota and became the Twins. Major League Baseball, realizing it's a national capital, this is where they can do antitrust hearings if they want to, immediately put an expansion team in Washington, D.C. again. So they never went without. What Milwaukee was hoping by the threat of the lawsuit, baseball would do the same thing. They would give us an immediate expansion franchise, or they would clear the way to allow a team like the Athletics to come to Milwaukee right away. That doesn't happen. And because of that, the lawsuit dragging all the way up to the Supreme Court, in the end, the Supreme Court refused to pick up the case, but that was decided in 1967. Milwaukee gets bypassed for expansion. They put an expansion team in Seattle. They put one in San Diego. They put one in Montreal before they thought of putting one in Milwaukee. So Fortunately, the team in Seattle failed, or I don't know if Major League Baseball would have ever returned to Milwaukee.
Do you feel like the Milwaukee County Board kind of killed the golden goose in a way?
Oh, in many ways they did, but I think they learned their lesson too, because the first thing they did when Bud Selig bought the Seattle Pilots out of bankruptcy court is they offered him a 25-year lease. So they locked him in for a long term right off the front end. But I mean, there's other things that were funny that changed in the lease. The county provided a lot of the concession material and stuff like that. When the Braves were there, they had to pay for all of it. So, you know, and again, I found this one of the most fascinating stories. At County Stadium, because the Packers played a couple games there, in 1965, when the Braves played their last season, the Braves were still obligated to run those concessions for the 3 Packer games that were played at County Stadium. So they actually could not vacate the stadium completely until that was done. And as soon as that was done, they played the last game on a November Sunday. The following Monday, the trucks showed up at County Stadium. They packed up the grills, the utensils. They dug out the backstop. They took the pitching mound. I mean, you know, the pitching rubber. They took home plate. They took all this stuff with them because they paid for it all. So when the Brewers came, the county had picked up the cost for a lot of this stuff. So they had material in the stadium so the Brewers, you know, couldn't in essence, you know, lease out or run their own concessions if they chose to. But yeah, it was a learning experience, I think, for everybody. And certainly they did a far better job working with Milwaukee. But, you know, Eugene Grobschmidt, who's mentioned in the book, in some ways kind of comes across a little bit as a villain. He became the kind of the face of the county struggles between the Braves and the county. But, you know, he understood, I think, the mistakes they had made in the past, and he was willing to take the flack for giving the Brewers a sweetheart deal. He knew it was a sweetheart deal, at least in comparison to what the Braves had. And he said he was willing, in essence, to take responsibility for that. And certainly had not the lessons been learned from the Braves situation, you know, who knows if the Brewers would still be here, because getting back to one of your earlier questions, when the debate came down to building a new stadium or trying to, you know, revamp County Stadium, the Brewers were within an eyelash of leaving. They would have gone somewhere else. They needed to, because they could not economically compete with some of the other teams in baseball. And that's where a lot of people who are not big fans of baseball or professional sports don't understand the value of the luxury boxes and all this other stuff. You know, if you go to TGI Fridays down at Miller Park, even if the Brewers are on the road, they make a percentage of that. That goes to their bottom line. That helps the club stay viable. If you don't have those opportunities, teams that don't have that are the ones that struggle, because you can't sign the free agents. You can't sign the scouts that go out and look for the players. And it becomes a vicious cycle between haves and have-nots. And so, you know, Miller Park allows the Brewers to be far more economically viable and competitive than County Stadium ever would have. So thank goodness that happened. But I love baseball. There's others that are still mad and have not gone to a game because they're mad Miller Park. They thought County Stadium was just fine, and, you know, to each their own.
Is there a moral to this story? Is there something you want people to take away from this book?
You know, I think the moral of the story is nobody owns the game. The owners thought they owned the game. Certainly that's reflective in the book with some of the stories I have in there. The players don't own the game, and the fans don't own the game. And the only way you're going to have harmony is when all 3 sides are working together. And I think you had that on the front end of the Milwaukee Miracle. Certainly it's gone on the back end of it. So the moral of the story is, you know, enjoy the team. And like I said before, if you build it, they may come. If you don't build it, they will leave.
What's the legacy of the Milwaukee Miracle in Milwaukee, and then also just in Major League Baseball?
Well, you know, it's funny. In Milwaukee in particular, if you go to games or you watch them on television, you'll always see somebody in the stand somewhere wearing a Braves cap. It's just iconic. You can see it in a sea of blue and gold. You will see that one hat sticking out, or a jersey or something. Even Miller Brewing, when they ran an advertising campaign a couple of years ago, showing fans walking into Miller Park, and there was a guy wearing a Braves shirt. You know, it's just amazing. It's still part of who we are. I think it opened up the door to a greater baseball experience in the South. I mean, you know, Atlanta clearly deserved Major League Baseball. And I certainly got far more sympathetic to the Braves organization as I did this. And I realized that it wasn't just simply greedy owners. And I think part of that process meant that the team in the South ultimately made baseball more of a national game than it had been before. And certainly the Braves benefited from that. I think all of Major League Baseball benefited from it, even at the expense of Milwaukee for 5 years. And I think that, from the national perspective, they look at that and, teams are far less likely to move now than they were in the past. I think ownership groups have realized it. The last team to move, the Montreal Expos to Washington, D.C., people have speculated, will Montreal get another expansion team? Toronto's gone up to Montreal a couple times and played a couple, games up there. They've drawn fairly well. I don't know if that'll ever happen again. But I think that's part of the legacy, that teams and cities will do far more now to keep a team. And it's not fair. It's not right. It's just the way it is.
The one other thing I wanted to ask you about the book, which was one thing I found fascinating, which is the beer culture that was in during the Braves time. People were allowed to carry in beer into the games. Talk to me a little bit about that and how that changed over the course of the life of the Braves in Milwaukee.
Well, it's funny because Milwaukee always has a reputation of being a fairly frugal town. I think that's one of the reputations of being, it's German heritage. But with having the breweries here, Milwaukee was the brewing capital of America, and you had, major breweries here. You had Joseph Schlitz, you had Pabst, you had Miller, you had Gettleman, all had brewery lines here. And oftentimes brewery workers would get free beer. So they could get a case of beer, whatever it would be a week. They could take it out to the ballpark. There were no restrictions on it because if you're building a municipal stadium, let the people carry in the product they want. It did create some safety concerns because you had people bringing glass bottles and periodically it'd start getting chucked around the field. It didn't happen too often, but it was enough of a safety concern. The problem was that the county didn't get any revenue from that, and neither did the team. Both wanted to restrict that. And Milwaukee County Stadium was the only place in Major League Baseball you could carry in your own beer. Every place else you had to buy it there. So certainly when you set the standard that you could carry in beer, any attempt after that to cut it out, right, is going to create a problem. So both the county and the Braves wanted the other guy to be the bad guy on the beer ban. The Braves would say, well, it's a safety concern. We're worried about fans getting hurt and all this other stuff. And the county's like, well, it's a revenue issue, and certainly we don't want to have, fans that can't afford to buy beer here at the ballpark, be outpriced or not come out to the game. So, we don't really want to do anything. Well, finally in 61, they get the county board to sign off on a beer ban. And it didn't ban beer in the state, it just meant you couldn't carry it in like any other ballpark you went to in America. But in Milwaukee, this is the worst thing ever. We can't carry beer into the ballpark. So there was an organized fan boycott as a result of this. Of course, the Braves are pointing at the county's pointing at the Braves. Finally, it gets rescinded. But by that point, the damage had already been done. And ironically, Milwaukee County sits on this until the Braves make the announcement they're going to leave, and then they put the beer ban back in place in 65. It's kind of final screw you to the team. But, there's a great story out of it, and I talk about it in the book. When the Cardinals came to town, there was at least one series where a couple intrepid, entrepreneurs brought a garbage pail full of ice and Budweiser, and they were selling it to the St. Louis fans in the stadium. And there technically wasn't a law against it. They eventually did get chased away, but they were selling their beer for half the price that you could buy a beer at County Stadium for. So I kind of tip my hat to those guys.
Nice. What about sports history appeals to you? Why is that something you want to study and teach? And what does it appeal? Why is it an important piece of history to study?
Well, I think in so many ways, sports history can be very unifying. It can be very divisive, between, groups that, here in Wisconsin, right? Packers fans versus Bears fans, or Packers fans versus Vikings fans. I mean, there's that element. But when you look at the political dynamics, of the United States or the state of Wisconsin, the one thing that brings people together is not politics. It's not religion. It's the Packers. It's talking about the Brewers. It might be how the Bucks are doing. It might be how the Badgers are going to do this year. Sport has the ability to unify us across economic income spectrums, across ethnic or racial divides, across religious divides, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whatever it would be. There's always that element of sport that is appealing to people. You see it in the World Cup. You see it with cricket championships. You see it in any, the Olympic Games certainly are part of that. But there's a unifying element to sport that we love. The negative is when we lose, There's always the ride aspect. There's the the negatives associated with it. But I find that fascinating because it is the human spirit in so many ways. And I think it's such a new end of scholarship to look at. I just think that with sport is the human spirit. With the human spirit, we see a fascinating avenue to study.
Thank you to Patrick Steele. Check out his book, Home of the Braves, The Battle for Baseball in Milwaukee. Lots of great detail in that book. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.